My name is Dr. Fernando Castillo, and for 17 years I worked for the National Parks Administration here in Argentina. I was posted all over the country, but most of my time was spent in a place known as Gran Chaco. El Ranch Chaco, or the Chaco Plains, as you might call them in English, is an area of semi-arid lowlands spanning several countries here in South America. It's a mix of savas and thorn scrub, but also subtropical forests, palm groves, and wetlands, and is home to thousands of unique and rare species of plants and animals. It is an incredibly beautiful place, but since the 1970s, the region has been plagued by illegal logging and forest fires set by cattle ranchers who want more area for their cattle to graze. In my final year of employment, Gran Chaco lost tens of thousands of hectares of forest, and I've seen the heartbreaking effects of men's greed with my own two eyes. But I've also seen far, far worse things in the forest of Gran Chaco. And of all of them, this is the one that haunts me the most. During the late summer of 1991, I was out doing some survey work around 20 miles north of a little town called Fuerza Esperanza. After crossing a long and desolate patch of flat scrubland, I reached a section of forest composed of algarrobo and pink trumpet trees. The algarrobo are particularly favorites of illegal loggers, so I wanted to make sure that this forest was untouched by their hands. Now, I spent around an hour walking around, making notes and marking the area on my map. And then once I was happy that the forest was in good condition, I started making my way back towards where I'd left my ATV. Gran Chaco is a very wild place, meaning many of the forests do not have any well-defined trails or paths to walk on. Even if they did, the nature of my work means I have to walk places that are infrequently traveled. So sometimes I lose my footing among the many roots and fallen branches. And this trip was no different. Most of the time, I merely stumble when catching my foot on something. But on this occasion, I caught my foot immediately after hopping over a thick branch which had fallen among some knee-high grass. I was totally unprepared for the second impediment and completely off my balance. So, after my foot caught on, I was sent tumbling into the grass in front of me with a very loud crunch. Notice how I described it as a crunch, not a thud, because I didn't fall directly into the dirt and grass. Something broke my fall, something hard, but kind of brittle. I didn't check to see what it was at first because my priority was to inspect the fresh grazes on my forearms and elbows. But then after picking myself up, I saw that I hadn't landed on a pile of fallen branches. I'd landed almost directly on a pile of bones. Since jaguars are very active in Gran Chaco, I initially thought that the bones must have belonged to a jaguar kill, perhaps a deer or some type of pig. But upon further inspection, I found that they were too large to be a pig of any kind, and too much like a monkey to be a deer. The forests are home to howler monkeys too. So, when I saw bones that looked remarkably like those of a human hand, I thought they belonged to some dead monkey. But then I saw the skull, and there was no mistaking things anymore. I had landed on a human skeleton, one that was filthy and moss-eaten. And when I realized that, a powerful feeling of mortal dread came over me. I picked myself up and crossed myself before brushing myself off. Unfortunately, that wasn't the first time that I'd found a human body hidden among the wilds of Gran Chaco, but it was the first that I'd found spontaneously, as in not on a search, and the first that I found in such a terrible state of decomposition. I carefully flattened some of the grass around it and then walked around it in a circle, studying it as I went. It looked like it had been there a long time, like the ground was already in the process of swallowing it up with dirt and grass. But then as I walked, I stood on something else that felt hard under my boot. And on closer inspection, I found a second skeleton just feet away from the first. It's hard to describe the feeling of abject terror one feels upon viewing human remains, unless you yourself have experienced the same sensation. But to see two sets of human remains in such quick succession, it made me fear for my life. It made me wonder what had happened there for two people to lose their lives in almost the same spot. And the dread that I felt was only amplified when I found the third skeleton, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. I came to realize that there were human remains for a 100 in every direction. And every couple of meters I saw the eyeless sockets of a skull as they stared back at me from the undergrowth. This was no ancient indigenous burial site either, as some of the remains came complete with half-rotted boots or sneakers lying close by. The place was a cemetery without graves, and I feared that whatever fate had befallen these poor souls would soon befall me. I left that place as quickly but carefully as I could, not wanting to disturb any more sets of human remains, and then drove straight back to the place my group was headquartered in, Puerto Esperanza. When I told our station chief what I'd seen, he demanded we drive back out onto Gran Chacaco so he could see for himself. He didn't think that I was lying or mistaken. He just simply wished to see such a thing for himself. And when we arrived, he was just as horrified as I was. And before we departed, we said a prayer for the dead together. And after that, it was out of our hands as the federal police stepped in to carry out their investigation. They are Argentina's equivalent of the FBI, and in coordination with our group from the National Parks Administration, they were able to paint a picture of what had happened to the many lost souls that we found. From around 10 years in the 70s and 80s, the Argentine government collaborated with several other South American countries for what was called Operation Condor. Condor was the code name given to the tactics of anti-communist repression that these countries employed. And then along with jailing activists and assassinating politicians, the Argentine security services began what came to be known as Los de la Muerta, or in English, the death flights. And this is when they would load a dozen prisoners onto an airplane or helicopter, fly them out into the middle of nowhere, and then throw them out of the aircraft to disappear them. Thousands of people were murdered this way, and to this day, many of their bodies have never been recovered. But as much as I am proud to have helped return many lost souls to their rightful resting places, there are still many more who remain missing. And although I am happy to have helped reunite these poor people with their long, grieving families, I'm haunted by the sight of what became of them. And some nights I dream that I too am being thrown to my death from the hold of an airplane. I used to be a surveyor for a large oil and gas company that will hereby remain unnamed. I think I'll also remain unnamed because the specifics of what I did for a living tend to make certain people very, very angry. See, I used to scour this great nation of ours looking for areas of outstanding natural beauty and assess their potential to be, in the words of one critic, pillaged and polluted so fat cat corporate types can make a buck. I guess that's not entirely wrong. Oil and gas have made a lot of people a lot of money. But modern oil and gas extraction is a lot less messy than it used to be. So, it's not like the places I recommend end up scorched, scarred, and devoid of all life. The primary reason I took the job is because I love being outdoors, and being a surveyor afforded me a heck of a lot of time in the field. The last thing I wanted is to see the environment ruined. But as a society, I knew we couldn't just switch to renewables overnight. So, I decided to live my dream of making a low six figures for being what was essentially a professional hiker and see if I couldn't do some good from the inside. But just because I was living my dream doesn't mean it was always smooth sailing. There was this one job that I took back when I first qualified as a surveyor. My third ever trip into the boonies that took me to the middle of nowhere, Arizona. I had to drive around 9 miles off-road, then hike another 4 or 5 just to get to my destination. Then once I'd taken my geophone readings, I turned around and then started making my way back to my truck. It was early fall, but those Arizona daytime temperatures were unforgiving. Not quite as unforgiving as the summertime, but it still made for a sweaty hike, and I had to stop about half a dozen times just to drink some water and let some sweat dry. I hadn't seen another living soul out there all day, but when I was on my third stop, only a couple of miles from where my truck was, I saw a lone hiker wandering down the trail. He looked to be about the same age as me, maybe a little younger, and he had this sort of California hippie look about him. He had shoulder-length long hair, loose-fitting shorts, and a shirt with some kind of Native American design on it, and then hiking shoes that looked like they'd seen better days. When he saw me, he smiled this big friendly smile and said something like, "All right, didn't expect to see a fellow traveler out in the trails today." Surveying could be a really lonely job, so I didn't mind the company. And then after he sat down opposite me on a rock, we got to talking about the trails in the area in general. It's not often I got company while I was working, so it was nice to be able to talk shop with someone. But then I guess I must have said something about work because the guy suddenly asked me if I was a ranger. It didn't even occur to me that I should bend the truth a little. So I told him, no, I wasn't a ranger. I was an oil and gas surveyor. He kind of frowned a little, then asked what the job entailed. And when I told him, I included all the necessary caveats about how it's all responsible regenerative practices that don't leave places polluted or scarred. And the guy just sat there listening to me speak. He kept that same chill facial expression, nodded along every so often, and even seemed to agree with some of the stuff I was saying. He asked me a few questions about pay and benefits and all that stuff. And at first, I got the impression that he was interested in becoming a surveyor himself. But then after the conversation meandered elsewhere and started to peter out a little, this hippie-looking guy suddenly turned to me and said, "I got a question about that whole surveying thing." I told him to fire away. And then with that same chill smile on his face, he said, "I can't help but wonder how the F do you sleep at night?" And the question was so unexpected, and the tone he used to ask it was still so friendly sounding that I honestly figured that I misheard him. Then when I repeated the question back to him to confirm it's what he'd said, he just nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world to ask of someone. I told him I slept just fine, that I worked for an energy company, not some evil megacorp who sells missiles or sketchy pharmaceuticals to third world countries. I still know that energy companies can be incredibly greedy. But my job was all about efficiency. If I did it properly, it would lead to less speculation, less drilling, and less destruction to the environment. But as much as I thought that I'd made that abundantly clear to my new hiking buddy, he obviously chose not to believe it. I remember he said, "Let me get this straight. You love the outdoors, but you're helping destroy it, and you don't lose any sleep over it." "I'll take bull crap for 200, Alex." I realized I'd lost the guy completely. That's if I ever really had him to begin with. I told him if he had a problem with what I did, that was his business, not mine. But if he really felt that way, it was probably best if we just changed the subject or just didn't hike together. I thought he'd want to get away from me since he was so disgusted by what I did. But he didn't. He stayed put and just kept on asking me how I was able to live with myself, knowing that I was contributing to the entire planet's destruction. And I was rapidly losing patience. So, I decided the best thing to do was to walk in the opposite direction that we were headed for a while. It meant adding time to my own hike, but by that point I didn't care. I wanted this guy away from me, but he seemed perfectly content to follow me up the trail while continuing to casually insult me. Eventually, I lost my temper completely and told him I either walked away or things were going to get physical. The guy raised his hands as if to say no need for fisticuffs and then said, "All right, man. You got it. I can see I got under your skin a little, but I'll be on my way." Then off he went, walking on down the trail until he was out of sight while I sat on a rock trying to breathe my anger away. And I gave it around 10 to 15. Enough time that we wouldn't run into each other again. And then I hit the trail. But I don't think that I made it more than a mile before I heard, "Hey, scumbag," from off the trail to my side, and I looked around to see that hippie guy walking out of the woods holding a pistol in his hand. Now, this was my turn to raise my hands as if to show that I didn't want the conflict. But the guy wasn't interested in anything I had to say anymore, and he kept the gun trained on me as he stepped out onto the trail. He then says, "Not so tough now, huh?" and then told me to get on my knees. When I told him I wouldn't do that, he put the gun right up against my head and told me I could either do as he said or he'd kill me right there and then. I honestly figured he was going to kill me no matter what I did. And if I was going to die, I wanted to go out with some dignity. I certainly wasn't some ninja who could karate chop the gun out of his hand before he pulled the trigger. But I also didn't want to give him the satisfaction of dropping to my knees and pleading for my life. I actually tried to say that too, but when I tried to speak, no words would come out. It felt like no matter what I did, no matter what I said, he was going to pull that trigger and everything would just cut to black. So instead of doing anything, I guess I just sort of shut down. And when I started to shake, he made fun of me for being scared and then goes into some big speech about how what he was doing, putting a gun to my head, was essentially what I was doing to the entirety of planet Earth. He couldn't understand how I was able to sleep at night, but he figured that he'd sleep like a goddamn baby if he blew my brains out because it only meant one less parasite to suck the life of Earth. I'm not going to make out like I wasn't terrified. I was more frightened out there than I've ever been in my entire life. But he was saying all this stuff I'd heard 100 times before. So, there was this kind of surreal moment where I found myself thinking, I can't believe this crap is the last thing I'll ever hear. The only time I found myself close to tears or showing any kind of emotion that wasn't hate and anger was when I thought about my mom and and how she'd wondered what happened to me if search and rescue didn't actually find my body. Thankfully, I didn't have to dwell on that long because before those thoughts managed to break me down completely, the guy pulled the trigger. It didn't shoot me. He moved the gun to the side at the last second and then fired a shot off right next to my ear. I didn't actually realize that I had been shot, though. It's almost like the explosion in my left ear and deafness that followed made me think that I'd actually been shot in the head. So, I just sort of collapsed to the ground, clutching the side of my head. And the last thing I kind of heard in my good ear before the guy eventually disappeared was the muffled sound of, "Quit your job, asshole." I honestly thought that I was a dead man because the shot had caused blood to come out of my ear and my whole head was just completely throbbing. So, I thought that I'd been hit and I had maybe seconds to live before I collapsed and bled out from a shot to the head. But after lying there waiting for everything to fade, I slowly realized that I was okay, or at least that I wasn't going to die. I managed to make it back to my truck, drove to a hospital to get my ear checked out, and then filed a police report as soon as I was able to. It took a while for my hearing to partially come back, as it's still not entirely back, and the cops didn't manage to catch up with the guy who almost deafened me. I didn't think that they would. I didn't even catch the guy's name, but it still makes me mad sometimes thinking that he just got away with that scot-free. I did end up quitting my surveyor's job, too. The social pressure just got too much, and I couldn't face lying about what I do for a living for the rest of my life. Now, I won't bore you with what I had to do now, but let's just say it's nothing a person might threaten to kill you over because it's on the wrong side of their politics.